Just a couple of weeks ago, the California Homeless Youth Project, where I work, released Pushing Back Against School Pushout, Student Homelessness and Opportunities for Change. So we've got a nice glossy new report here for us. If anybody is interested, there are stacks of them at the front table, so you can grab one afterwards. So what is the school to prison pipeline? These are punitive policies that push students out of the educational system and into the juvenile justice system. So this looks like all types of things, but it looks like zero tolerance policies, which are extremely kind of punitive responses. And it started off being about just a certain number of really serious infractions. But what we've seen schools across the country do is really add to the list of infractions that constitute zero tolerance and kind of make it grounds for expulsion for a whole range of things. So there's kind of a debate about whether this is actually like extreme, extreme sort of behavior, or is it just misbehavior? Unfortunately, what we see is that zero tolerance policies and things like that lead to the discriminatory enforcement of rules on marginalized students, which also leads to less accessibility to educational attainment. One of the ones that I just want to point out on there is willful defiance, which is sometimes used as like kind of a catch-all for students that are, quote, sort of misbehaving. What we saw in California was that willful defiance counted for about 17% of suspensions in schools, and 6% of those were for students experiencing homelessness. We know students experiencing homelessness are only about 3% of our student body, so they're really overrepresented in who is getting suspended for willful defiance. There was a state bill this past year that would have eliminated willful defiance or put a ban on it, I think, through 8th grade. It passed out of the legislature, but it was vetoed by the governor. So that was a little bit disappointing. They wanted to leave it up to schools and teachers to kind of make that determination, but it's sort of controversial, I think, for all the reasons that you'll see in this presentation. So school resource officers. One of the most interesting things to me that we found in doing this research was that the advent of school resource officers, these are police officers that are based in schools, started after Brown versus the Board of Education, and when schools were required to comply with desegregation. So there's sort of a very racially loaded history with this decision to add police officers to public schools. What we see is that SROs are not required to keep track of all of the interactions they're having with students on campuses. Police officers in any other realm are required to report on all interactions they have with people because of the California's Racial and Identity Profiling Act, right? We understand that sometimes these interactions with law enforcement are inherently discriminatory, and having track of that is one of the ways that we can, show disproportionality. So when school resource officers aren't required to do that in schools, it makes it a little bit harder for us to kind of keep track of discriminatory kind of interactions besides just enforcement. They often have little to no training on youth development, so they don't necessarily get special training to be placed in schools, which is problematic because we know that students and kids, young folks, aren't just little adults. They have, unique developmental needs and need to be kind of treated and understood in that particular context. And so we've seen too, probably people have seen some like major media stories of really extreme reactions, sometimes even for minor misbehaviors like using a cell phone in class or being sort of disrespectful. And then we see resource officers using pepper spray or handcuffs, physical restraints. We know these things to be really traumatic events for young people. So who are the students that are at risk? What we see is that there's really disproportionate kind of enforcement around suspensions and expulsions for students of color. We know that Black students are 3.5 times more likely to be expelled than their white peers, and Latino students are 1.5 times more likely to be expelled than their white peers. LGBT students are 1.5 times more likely to be expelled than their straight or cisgender peers. And students with disabilities represent about 20 to 24% of the suspended and expelled student population nationally. So students with disabilities are really disproportionately impacted. And obviously these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive groups, right? There's a lot of overlap between these different communities, but it also kind of creates like multiply marginalized identities, which means they're kind of particularly at risk for this type of kind of contact with law enforcement in schools. What we see too is that the inequitable wealth distribution and lack of affordable housing and discrimination in schools really reinforces, I think, the trends of homelessness that we see outside of schools. So the school to prison pipeline and youth homelessness, these students that are coming to school, they often don't have adequate rest. We've talked about that a little bit yesterday. Access to food, their nutrition and hygiene needs met. Sometimes they don't have a safe place to store belongings. So one of the examples that we learned about while we were doing our research was a student who was carrying all the cutlery for their family after they had been kicked out of their house. So they had stuff in their backpack, forks, knives, spoons. They were expelled from school. And so for a student who is experiencing homelessness that is expelled from school, that's really, disconnecting them from a major source of stability in an otherwise pretty chaotic situation. You can see there's some of the statistics that we found here in California. And just seeing the numbers of students, about 15,000 students that were suspended at least once, and over 300 students expelled, all experiencing homelessness, that really leads to, educational inequity. That's not what we want to see for our student community. I thought it was also important to point out that foster youth had some of the highest rates of suspension, along with runaway and homeless youth and youth with disabilities. We heard a little bit yesterday about the Chapin Hall study, Missed Opportunities, the national study on youth homelessness. One of the things that they found was that students who don't complete their high school education or get a GED were 4.5 times more likely to be experiencing homelessness, which was the greatest predictor of homelessness that they found within their study. Keeping kids in school really means preventing and ending homelessness. These young people are subject to trauma. We know that homelessness in and of itself is a traumatic experience and that most of them have had really traumatic experiences before even becoming homeless. A lot of misbehavior really is trauma, and it's the manifestation of trauma, but when there's a lack of understanding of kind of trauma-informed care, people call it things like willful defiance. The ramifications during school are tremendous as well as lifelong. You can kind of see some of the illustration of the school to prison pipeline in some of these statistics. I'll just highlight a couple. That for students who experience arrests, the risk of dropping out is doubled, so it kind of goes that way. But it impacts employment, lifetime earnings, and contact with the justice system. So we have better ideas. It's so ironic to me that our education system uses something that's not at all evidence-based. So we know that these zero-tolerance, willful defiance things, they are not only not informed by the research, there's a mountain of literature that says they are ineffective and harmful, and there's another mountain of literature that says that these things are better. Things like restorative justice, responsive classrooms, trauma-informed schools, and these are the things that engage students in the school community rather than disengage them. So we have just a couple of recommendations. There's more in the report, but I wanted to highlight a few, which is that we should look at school policies with the lens of student experiencing homelessness. A lot of times things are coded in classist and racist ways, like school dress codes. We need to fund professionals who are trained on the developmental and culturally competent needs of these students, right? We need more school social workers, kind of less school-based police. We need to move away from zero-tolerance policies. Homeless liaisons are advocates for these students, so they should know when they might be expelled and be able to advocate for them accordingly. And we need to do a better job of collecting data on what's happening in terms of students experiencing homelessness and the school to prison pipeline to reduce disproportionate impact. So please go ahead and feel free to keep in touch, share copies of the report, and come hang out with me. Thanks so much.